Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our final lesson, Lesson 16, our final lesson in Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, pages 218 to 228. It will wrap up the study. Let's go to block 1. Okay, block 1. Jesus taught with authority. Mark 7:28 and 29. The people were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one having authority. Christ's teachings have an exclusive power over us, says Bonhoeffer, toward which we surrender and obey. He brings the word from eternity. We do not offer interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount. We don't question it. We respond with discipleship. Our house is founded on Christ's word. Then Bonhoeffer goes to the harvest, Matthew 9:38. Pray unto the Lord of the harvest that he will send forth those to labor. Christ's power of healing belongs to the sick and to the poor. The ministers of the temple in the days of Christ had failed in this ministry. Christ encountered Jewish people who were enslaved to a state of anguish of conscience. They couldn't satisfy works righteousness. They were in anguish of conscience. They were enslaved to works righteousness, and the ministers of the temple had turned it into a profit-making market, completely failing in ministry. And that's why Christ cleansed the temple the way that he did. Let's go to block 2 and take a look at we are sent into the harvest. We are sent as messengers and as fellow workers. We are equipped with effective spiritual power to overcome unclean spirits by the power of the choice and the call of Christ. By the choice and the call of Christ. Our work is Christ's work. It is Christological. We depend on the will of Christ. We are free from secular ideology. Bonhoeffer was free from the idolatry of Nazism because our ministry is based on the authorization of divine promise, bound by Christ's commission. After Israel rejected the gospel, it came to the Gentiles. And that was after the resurrection of the crucified Christ. And Bonhoeffer goes to Matthew 10:7 and 8. In fact, he's going to finish up in chapter 10 of Matthew. Freely you have received, therefore freely give. Freely proclaim the gospel. Freely give the gospel. So, in this final lesson, and like I said, this course was the course at the underground seminary, and it works out for us to be 16 lessons, but in this final lesson, Bonhoeffer was to underscore the fact that we minister in our discipleship based on the authority of Christ. We have an authoritative foundation. And we are sent by Christ. It's his call that sends us. And that authoritative foundation had to be reinforced to Bonhoeffer's students because they were facing the Nazi regime. And that's what we're going to address in block 3. Sheep in the midst of wolves. We continue in Matthew 10. Matthew 10:16. Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves, therefore be wise and be harmless. And I love what Bonhoeffer says here. We have not chosen the way ourselves. No, the way is a mission inaugurated by Christ himself. And it is given to us with a promise of Christ's abiding presence with us. Christ is with us. Christ abides with us as we choose and participate in the way of Christ. We're talking about an abiding presence. We are called to a state of certainty, says Bonhoeffer, of the abiding in the Word. And by abiding in the Word, we practice true wisdom. We must stand our ground even in the midst of Nazi idolatry. Dietrich Bonhoeffer stood his ground. Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth wrote the Barmen Declaration, protesting Nazi idolatry, refusing to allow Nazi idolatry compromise the gospel of Jesus Christ. They stood their ground, and they were both exiled out of Germany because they stood their ground, because they stood for Christ. They were exiled out of Germany. Barth ended up in Switzerland. Bonhoeffer ended up in New York, safely teaching in New York, but then returned to Germany, taught for 2 years in this underground seminary where he taught a course in discipleship. After 2 years, the Gestapo shut it down, arrested Bonhoeffer, threw him into a concentration camp, and it cost Dietrich Bonhoeffer his life to stand his ground for the gospel of Christ. He would not compromise. So the teaching we have here has been exemplified by the teacher. Not just words. His life's blood is mixed with his teaching. He gave his life for what he teaches here. We are called to a state of certainty. We abide in the Word. We must stand our ground. That's the way we wrap up here. We are called to a state of certainty. We must abide in the Word. We must stand our ground. And it's a beautiful conclusion. We'll do a quick recap here and wrap this up. But in Block 1, I like Note 2. It makes a good point. We do not offer interpretations of the Sermon on the Mount. Bonhoeffer says it's not needed. The Sermon on the Mount is clear. We are to surrender in discipleship. We don't interpret it. We don't question it. We practice the response of discipleship. Our life is founded on the Word of Christ. Now, Block 2, we'll go to Note 2 again. Our work is Christ's work. It depends on the will of Christ. We are free from all secular ideologies. If that could be Neoplatonism, and Bonhoeffer's day it was the Nazi idolatry. We are free from all secular ideologies. What was equally protested by Emil Brunner was the Catholic reliance on Aristotelian philosophy. Brunner, Barth's disciple, didn't like Thomas Aquinas linking God's word with Aristotle's philosophy. He was against Neoplatonism. And even though I do like Thomas Aquinas, I do think he has something to offer, I also greatly admire Emil Brunner. So I have to say that Brunner makes a good point in his stand against the compromise of any ideology. And then Block 3, just to wrap up, we're going to read all of Block 3. Matthew 10:16, Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise and be harmless. Because you didn't choose the way yourself. You were inaugurated into that mission by Christ himself, with a promise of Christ's abiding presence. We are called to a state of certainty. We are called to abide in the Word. We are called to true wisdom. We must stand our ground. We are called to a state of certainty, a state of great conviction and certainty. We are called to abide in the Word, which is true wisdom, and we must stand our ground and not allow the gospel to be compromised. And there are many attempts to compromise the gospel today. You've got the so-called enlightened society trying to get Christianity to compromise the gospel, to affirm things that should not be affirmed. And Bonhoeffer says no. You don't compromise with a secular ideology. You don't compromise with all those attempts to dilute the gospel, to compromise the gospel, to hinder the gospel by coupling it with idolatry. For Bonhoeffer, that was Nazi idolatry. But a very brief finish, 218 to 228. But congratulations to all of you who went through all 16 lessons. I think we've really been blessed by Bonhoeffer here. 16 lessons on the doctrine of discipleship. All 16 lessons came from the underground seminary in Nazi Germany, where Bonhoeffer taught these lessons at the risk of his own life. And we've been blessed that they have been preserved. And now we can say that we've wrapped up our year with a great 16 lesson study on the doctrine of discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And we usually take, this is will be the end of November when we finish up. We usually take December off, or we schedule other things in December, and then we'll discuss the next year, what we're going to do in 2023. Thank you, my friends. That wraps up Dietrich Bonhoeffer's very powerful Cost of Discipleship.